Hey, I'm Julie Lerman. I do a lot of work with Entity Framework and Entity Framework Core now. I have this presentation that I created recently for some conferences on some cool new features of EF Core 6. And every time I've done them for the conferences, I never feel like I have enough time. I had an hour once to do it, and I just squeezed it in. The next time I had 45 minutes, but they wanted me to leave a little of that 45 minutes for Q&A. Of course, I wasn't able to. So I decided I would just record it the way I wanted to, so I could take the time I wanted to with the demos and explain things the way I want to. So I don't know how long this is going to end up being. It will be over an hour, but I can't imagine that it'll be too much longer than that. But the whole point is so that I can really take the time to show you things the way I built the demos and really wanted to show them, instead of being like, well, I can't do this, can't do that. And because I'm just doing this for myself, for you, I am not worrying about the fact that my husband is upstairs doing something with our wood stove that's making a lot of noise and, things like that, right? Like if I was doing a Pluralsight course, I'd be like, leave the house, come back tonight for dinner, and maybe bring me dinner so I can just work and not even have to cook. And for a conference, we still like it to be somewhat professional. Anyway, for this, I don't care. This is just between you and me. And so here we go. The title of this talk, Working on the Bucket List, actually, I derived that when I created an article for Code Magazine, and I made the same title. And it's because the kind of features that we're getting with EF Core 6, or I should say that we have now because it was released a few weeks ago. I'm doing this at the end of November 2021, are the kinds of things that the team has been wanting to attack for a while, and a lot of users have been asking for a while, and they finally, got some really important things done. And now, whoa, I wonder what that was. I don't know if you could hear it. I certainly could. Like he just dropped a big, huge log on the floor or something. I know that's not what happened. Anyway, so, things that we've been wanting also. So they finally had time, after getting all kinds of other really important things done on EF Core 3 and EF Core 5. So EF Core 6, they did make lots and lots of little changes also, but there's all these big things that they've really been wanting to dig into. So they did in this version. Well, this was a bit of a surprise to me. As I was starting to tell this story about EF Core 6, I realized that I was sharing a lot of really good information, things that I found really interesting as I was doing my research and learning. So I talk a lot. And about halfway through this, I realized, oh, maybe I should make this a series. So in this particular video, which is, I think, about 50 minutes long, I'll start by just making sure you understand where we're at timeline-wise with the various releases, what platform, actually it's not plural, what platform it's supported on, EF Core 6 is supported on, and what IDEs you can use. So that's just a little bit so you know where we're at. And then I'll spend the rest of this video talking about query performance in EF Core 6. So you'll see along the way, I'm like, oh, maybe this should be a series. So I'll break it up, but I'll publish them as I complete them. And so a few things to be aware of with this release and how it relates to some of the other releases around it. So we're on about an annual cadence now, November 2019, 2020, 2021, along with the .NET release schedule. So Entity Framework Core 5 was released in November 2020 at the same time as .NET 5 and ASP.NET Core 5, and just all of the things that went along with .NET 5. Then EF Core 6 was released with .NET 6 just this month, November 2021. And what's important to know about this, well, there's a lot of important things, but what I want to point out is that this is a long-term support release. So not every release of .NET 6 and its satellites, if I may refer to EF Core and ASP.NET Core that way, not every release is long-term support. NA Framework Core 5 wasn't a long-term support. So EF Core 6 and .NET 6 and its satellites are now long-term support. So they'll be supported for a lot longer than some of the other releases. How does that relate to other things? Which is, so moving forward, .NET 7 is scheduled to release November 2022. So 1 year again, a 1 year cadence. So I think we can assume that NA Framework Core 7 will come along with .NET 7. Now, I've noticed that when they're talking about the next version, which they're already working on and focusing on, in GitHub Conversations, I've noticed a couple of people from the team referring to it as EF7, not EF Core 7. Now, I don't know if that means anything, right? So we never had an EF7. We almost did, right? That was when they really changed to Core. So we never had an EF7. We have the EF6, and it's still, in use by millions of applications, I think, or lots and lots and lots of them. So it would have been confusing for EF Core 6 to be called EF6. But now I wonder if they're really going to be calling it EF7. I don't know, right? And just because I saw them say that doesn't have deep meaning. That just could be, that's just what they're called, just how they're referring to it. But it doesn't, it's not a promise of that name. And, I what's in a name, right? Rose is a rose. So, maybe not that important, right? So related to the long-term release support, what I also want to make sure you know is that in May 2022, the support for Entity Framework Core 5 is going to end. It's going to still be there, but they're not going to be iterating on it. Obviously, any iterations are going into new versions. But the support for .NET 6 and its satellites is going to end in May 2022. But the .NET 6 and EF Core 6, they're going to last a lot longer because they're long-term support. EF Core 3.1 was long-term support, so it's also important to keep in mind that its support will end in December of 2022. And I have a link down at the bottom of this slide, which is the roadmap for .NET itself. And again, you can hopefully assume that the EF Core release schedule aligns with that. So I think that's important. And now you have an idea of that information. I'm wondering why my down arrow keeps not working. Here's something important to know. I should have this on a slide. I just realized EF Core 6 has to be used on .NET 6. You can't use it on .NET 5. You have to use it on .NET 6. That's the only thing that supports it. Not .NET Standard, right? Just .NET 6 is the only thing that supports EF Core 6. That also means if you're using Visual Studio, you have to use Visual Studio 2022, right? You can use it in Visual Studio Code. As a matter of fact, all my demos will be in VS Code. But .NET 6, .NET 6 relies on Visual Studio 2022. EF Core 6 relies on .NET 6. Therefore, you can only use EF Core 6 in .NET 6 on Visual Studio 2022. So the first big improvement with NA Framework Core 6 is query performance. Like they actually focused a lot on performance. And also, you may or may not be aware of the fact that the performance of .NET 6 compared to .NET 5 also has greatly improved. So there's some hand waving. So the query performance. As part of this bucket list, they really, really wanted to finally dig into performance because, there's been a lot of complaints about that. And quite often, well, there's a lot of times people will compare the performance to raw ADO.NET. And, that's just not fair. That's completely raw SQL being sent to the database. You're not getting any of the, the mapping magic and the link queries and all of that. So, there's a lot that NA Framework is doing for us. So that's kind of an unfair comparison. But another ORM that EF Core is compared to a lot is Dapper. Now, again, potentially, we're still not comparing apples to apples because Dapper, you actually have to feed Dapper SQL. Right? You can't just do a link query and have that work. So, you're giving it the SQL that it's going to run, so it doesn't have to do all that processing and figuring that out. On the way back, materializing data, et cetera, into objects, there, that's fair to compare those. Regardless of whether it's a fair comparison or not, it was a really interesting target for EF Core's team to say, well, let's see if we can at least get it to be as fast as Dapper, even when Dapper has that advantage of, not having to transform link and, read through the models, et cetera, to come up with a SQL, right? Even with that. So they focused on, how will they do this comparison? How are they going to make sure they're having an even comparison? Well, there's an industry standard benchmark for application performance, and part of that also is focused on data access. So the whole kit and caboodle is called TechnPower, and the set of benchmarks within TechnPower that are focused on data access is called Fortunes. So it's TechnPower Fortunes. And this it's actually kind of cool to look at. And you know what? This is me taking all the time I want to do this talk. So let me escape out of here. I'll just give you a quick look at TechnPower Fortunes. Okay, so techandpower.com, and then in the benchmarks, and here's, they published them in rounds. So you can see round 18 was in the middle of 2019. Round 19 was in May of 2020. The latest round was at the beginning of this year, so in February 2021. So if you look down here, it's comparing all kinds of frameworks, and it's not just the framework, it's like this combination of things. So if you're most familiar, like me, with, .NET stuff, I'm going to scroll back up here, and you can see, I'm just going to scroll down. Okay, so here's ASP Core. So this one here is what I'm reading is it's ASP.NET Core. Oh, you can see with my brain, I know what that's called. I've been programming for 30 plus years. Anyway, you can see in the highlight that this is an ASP.NET Core. It's using ADO, right? So it's using raw database connectivity. It's not using Entity Framework. The database it's using is PostgreSQL. And then, so these are all these different platforms, different databases, different frameworks, right? And the combination thereof. And then the TechnPower Fortunes, in order to publish your data as part of this benchmark, you have to follow the benchmark guidelines to a T, right? So then everybody's comparing apples to apples. So if we can look down, scroll down, and look for another ASP.NET Core. So here's ASP.NET Core. Well, even if this doesn't pop up, we've got it over on the right. So it's using .NET. It's using Kestrel as the server. It's using Postgres database. It's using a micro ORM. So which micro ORM is it? I don't know. Maybe it's Dapper. But I think when we've seen Dapper, when we've seen the use of Dapper, that might be. You know, I hadn't noticed that before. So I'm looking. Notice how far down we are. So what this is showing, what the bar graph is showing is how many reads per second this combination is able to perform when, you know, the application is designed specifically to the specs. And the applications are very, very streamlined, right? This is all they're focused on is just doing these simple reads. How many can they do? So it's not like some, you know, real world application you're building. But still, it's comparing apples to apples. Everybody's doing the same thing. Where's Entity Framework here? Here's ASP Core with Visual Basic and ADO.NET. Oh, here we go. Entity Framework down at 95. Again, this is using .NET 5 and EF Core 5. So this isn't all about EF Core, right? This is also a reliance on .NET 5. This is using PostgreSQL. All right, so this is just giving you an idea of where we were at. So the team said, you know, can we at least get closer, like when we're using Entity Framework? Oh, look, there's Dapper. I see it right there. So Dapper is all the way up here, also PostgreSQL. So the only difference here is Dapper versus Entity Framework. So can we get Entity Framework to be as fast as this? That's what it's all about. Now, I do have in one of the upcoming slides, they even though we don't have the latest version that's showing .NET 6 and EF Core 6, they do have the benchmarks. The benchmarks, everybody's publishing the benchmarks as previews continuously, like once a day, twice a day, whatever. So you can actually get to the closest raw data, and I will show that to you. I'll just leave that there. And then back to slides. See why this is so much more fun for me? I hope, you know, you might say, oh, I'm going to watch part of it today and part of it tomorrow and part of it, right? This is just like everything I wanted to talk about. So that's what TechnPower is. And comparing, using the TechnPower benchmark, using .NET 6, ASP.NET Core 6, and Entity Framework Core 6, the performance with that combination is 70% faster than that same combination with .NET 5, ASP.NET Core 5, and EF Core 5. So the 70%, it's hugely faster. Some of that is thanks to how much faster .NET 6 is. No question about it. So when they were able to, you know, break that down, Entity Framework Core 6 is responsible for 31%, nearly half of that increase. So EF Core 6 is still a lot faster than EF Core 5. So looking a little more closely at the comparison to Dapper and the comparison, you know, as we're moving from EF Core 5 plus .NET 5 to EF Core 6 plus .NET 6. So this is a screenshot, so I could not change. This is a screenshot from one of the team's blog posts, which I have another link to, I think, in the next slide. So where they were starting, so the chart that we just looked at where EF Core was down at 95 and Dapper was at, I think, 65. So the number of reads per second for EF Core 5 was, and I just want to make sure you understand, this isn't all about EF Core 5. It's also .NET 5 and ASP.NET Core 5. So reads per second was about 148,000 per second. And Dapper was 230,000 reads per second. So Dapper, the gap there is a 55.8% gap, right? So that's what we're looking at. That's where they were starting. So the first thing they did, they realized that the benchmark tests that they had built for EF Core 5 were not totally up to the standards of what the TechnPower Fortunes required. And that actually was detrimental to them. So it wasn't like they were cheating and it was better than it could have been. It was actually worse than it could have been because they weren't following all of the guidelines to a T. So they tweaked how the tests were being built. So that has nothing to do with any changes in the product. So they're still on EF Core 5 and still on .NET 5, but they fixed up the tests. And just in doing that, they brought the EF Core numbers up dramatically. So right there, just having the tests, right? So that doesn't mean .NET 5 just got faster and EF Core 5 just got faster, but at least the tests are now where they ought to be. So that actually brought the gap, shrunk the gap by 20%. Like that was pretty amazing. Now it's time. Now they took the whole thing and just put it on .NET 5, right? Didn't change the app at all, but just put it on .NET 6. So it's still EF Core 5 and ASP.NET 5. And so .NET 6, right by itself, improved the number of reads per second. So now we're at almost 210,000 reads per second. And Dapper's application moving to .NET 6 also benefited from that, right? So now it was about 14% faster. So now the gap just got a little bigger again, right? So somehow .NET 6, Dapper benefited a little more from .NET 6 than EF Core did. I don't know why. So now they take the application and they're moving it to using Entity Framework Core 6. Okay, so with all the changes that they've made to EF Core 6, run the tests again. And now they're getting 252,000 reads per second. So in that particular jump, just tweaking the APIs where they've already gotten .NET 6 speed out of the way, they've already made the tests faster. That's where they got the 31% number, right? That now just changing EF Core from EF Core 5 to EF Core 6, it improved dramatically, like by almost 32%. And look at the gap between EF Core and Dapper now. It's only 4.5%. So they really narrowed it dramatically. So I think that's pretty interesting. Here's the link I mentioned that will show the latest preview for the benchmark. So this is moving into round 21, which hasn't been published yet. But I'm going to open that up. Did I do the right keystroke? Control click, right? Oh, just click. Just click. Okay, so see, this is unofficial. I don't know what the latest dates are on these, but this is for the round 21. So I'm just going to scroll down. So here's ASP.NET Core using ADO.NET and Postgres. So that's 11. So that's showing, the .NET 6 and ASP.NET Core improvement, because this was a lot lower down before. ASP.NET Core still with ADO. ASP.NET Core with Dapper. Remember, it was 65. Now that's 31, ranking 31. So, Dapper's not really changing a lot, but that is mostly going to be the ASP.NET improvements in .NET 6. Okay, so that's 31. And here is Entity Framework, right? So it's ASP.NET Core, PostgreSQL, and Entity Framework. So they've moved from 95 ranked up to 43 in the whole scheme of things, and they've dramatically also closed the gap between Dapper and Entity Framework Core. So all that's really super cool, right? Really, really impressive. And I love having the time to really walk you through all of that. I really wasn't familiar with the Fortune's benchmarks or TechnPower, so I really had to explore and learn I asked about, I looked at, it's all open source, and the work that the EF team did, like their test, that's on GitHub. But it was not something for me to run myself because it's actually really a lab environment that they're running it in, and they have extra, it's not like me on my computer where, I'm running it on a server on the same computer where I'm developing it, right? So they've got separate servers and all this kind of stuff. So I'm not going to be running tests like that. But I did make my own little tests. So I'm just going to show you a couple of other things. Well, before you see my test, so I'm saying, oh, everything's faster and showing you all these benchmarks. But what do? How do they make it faster? So there's this really detailed GitHub issue that lists a lot of the details of this. And Shiro Jansky also, because he was really the team member who was the most focused on this, he wrote a great blog post. I've got links to all this stuff also at the end of the deck, so I'll be referring to them. So here's some of the highlights I pulled out of his blog post. One of the places where they got a very big improvement was by improving on the pooling and recycling in EF Core. So you might be familiar with the fact that we've had pooling, DB context pooling, since was it EF Core 2, or I think it was EF Core 2. And it was very focused on, in ASP, using in web apps, but you can actually use it in client-side apps if you want. So what they did was they added to that pooling, that's kind of that's an opt-in thing, right? You have to say, I want to take advantage of the pooling. And the DB context pooling, what it does is, rather than always having to instantiate a new DB context, they'll keep pooling will keep existing instances around. They'll get flushed out, right? So they won't be tracking anything, but when you need a new DB context, it will grab it from that pool instead of spending the time to instantiate a new DB context. So that made a nice improvement in your applications. So what they've done was, when you're using the pooling, it's also now including DB connections and DB commands and DB data readers, and some other internal objects are all getting pooled together along with the DB context. So when you're using pooling in EF Core 6, the pooling itself makes an app 23% faster than the just plain DB context pooling in EF Core 5. So that was a big hit right there. Another thing that they did to the APIs, and this is just happens on its own. And I didn't really understand this the first time I read through it, but then, I just read through it a few times so that I understood it better. So when you use logging, when you're logging your EF Core work, whether it's the SQL or what the DB context change tracking, things like that, or if you're using interceptors, in case you're using that, NA-Frame or Core has to just check, like, is this a point at which I need to log something? Is this a point at which I need to intercept something? And it was doing it a lot, like just constantly doing it. And it was constantly doing that also at the same time that it's trying to process a query. So that was interfering with the query performance. So what they've done was they are checking a lot less frequently, and you won't notice, right? If you're using interceptors or using any logging, you're not going to notice this at all. But it's not going to affect the logging or interception at all, but it will improve the query performance. So there's a little more to it, but essentially they're not they're just not hitting it as much, and also they're making this little just enough of a delay to let the darn query finish doing its work, and then they can, report it and give you the information they need. So that's probably not the most pinpoint perfect description of it, but like I said, like reading through the explanation like a couple of times really helped me go, oh, okay, I get it. Yeah, I got it enough, right? Because in the long run, like this super duper detail, since I'm not programming it, not important, right? Like I just kind of get that they made this improvement, and in the way they're doing logging, they looked at it and said, hey, this is expensive the way we're doing it. So that's another 7% improvement, and that just happens. It's nothing you have to do anything about. This is interesting, the thread safety checks. So that's actually something, thread safety checks happen by default, kind of as they should, but they turn out to be expensive as well. So what they did is give you in the API, there's some logic where you can opt out of the thread safety. So why would you opt out of thread safety? You would opt out if you've already done all the thread safety checks while you're running, debugging, testing your application, right? You need to make sure it's thread safe before you put it in production. So by the time you get it to production, when it's running in production, it doesn't need to continue doing those thread safety checks. So you can opt out for production. And with your production applications, then that gave us another 7% reduction over Entity Framework Core 5. So link down here, I'll just, why not, right? I'll click it. This is the, oh no. Looks like something went wrong. I wonder, oh, that's good to know. Let me see if I've got it. I'm just going to scroll all the way to the end because I'm going to go to the this here's the Announcing EF Core 6 Preview 4 Performance Edition. This is the blog post that Shai wrote with all of the details. That's where I got this, the 70% faster, etc. And here's the link. The full list of improvements done in this optimization round is available. Okay, it wasn't me. I don't know what happened. They might have moved it. There might have been another issue that they combined it with. So I will figure that out. But not right now. So I'm going to scroll back. So we're still talking about query performance. I just don't look at any of this stuff. Another thing to be aware of about this query performance improvement, it just occurred to me, I should probably just do this as like a series of videos. So I think that's what I'll do. Then I'm going to go back after I finish up this bit. I'm going to go back and just add a little something at the beginning of this video saying, hey, I was just going on and on and on, so I decided to do this as a series of videos instead of, 4 hours long. So this also is very important to understand. So I've been talking about query performance improvement. Be aware that all of this performance improvement was for non-tracking queries. That was their focus, okay? And their intention for EF Core 7 is to make that same effort on queries that are being tracked by the DB context as you're executing them, because there's a lot more work going on if your queries are being tracked. So if the results come back from the database and Entity Framework Core is materializing them, if it has to keep track of the state of all of those results, then it's building up the little objects that it needs to, the little tracking objects. It's doing a lot more work. So all of this improvement is that we're seeing now in EF Core 6 is for non-tracking, but they learned so much. So there will be some benefit to tracked queries, but you're not going to see the huge performance gain that you're seeing with non-tracking queries. So they're going to take what they learned for EF Core 6, and then they're going to dig into how can they use that, leverage what they learned to make tracked queries faster in EF Core 7. So if you're doing your own little benchmark texts or whatever, don't freak out when you're like, well, this is only 10% faster, right? If it's tracked queries. So I also, because I was not able to set up a lab environment to run the TechnPower's benchmarks on my own setup, I just created my own little application. And I'll just show you what that looks like. I actually created two. One for EF Core 5. So if you look down here, I have a whole bunch of branches in this set of demos. So this is called EF Core 6 perf, and there's one that's EF Core 5 perf. Okay, the difference, there's two differences between these. One is, if you look in CS Proj of the EF Core 5, it's referencing EF Core 5, but they're both targeting .NET 6. So I wanted to compare apples to apples again, right? I didn't want to have my results also reflecting how much slower .NET 5 was. So the EF Core 5 version is using .NET 5 and EF Core 5. And then here's the EF Core 6 version. And what I'm doing in here is I'm actually just running two queries. And I've set this up, and I should say I set this up with help from Shai because I really wanted to make sure I was testing just the query effort, not the effort of instantiating the DB context, not, all those other things it does. I really wanted to push all of that stuff out of the way. So I followed Shai's guidance for setting this up. And so this is another benefit of me doing this, a kind of blown out version of these demos in this session, because I can really kind of explain what's going on here. So in the long run, I have two queries. So I'm going to just scroll down. I have these two methods. One is going to be querying 1,000 rows, and the other only queries one row. Okay, so there's a bunch of things to be aware of in here. Notice I've got this benchmark, right? And if you scroll up here, benchmark.net. So I never used benchmark.net before, and boy, I could have had a V8, right? Benchmark.net is actually created by the .NET team, and it sets up benchmarks so that if you if you just tell it what method you want to benchmark, right? Test the timings of. When a lot of people don't know how to set up benchmarks, you need to do warm-ups, right? You need to warm things up. You need to throw out outliers. There's all kinds of good practices for doing benchmark testing. So benchmark.net actually takes care of all of that stuff. All you have to do is let it know what method you want it to test. So I'm using benchmark.net, and because I've been doing backyard benchmark testing with ADO.net and EF Core for years and years and years, and it's always like start timer, end timer, but having to do the warm up and then doing it like 100 times and everything. So you don't have to worry about any of that with benchmark.net. It takes care of all of that, and it has a default, I think, of 100 of how many times it will run the test. to get the average, get the means, throw out the really slow versions and the really fast versions that don't really make sense. And you can actually tweak that also. I can't remember if I tweaked that number, so I'm just scrolling down to look because I set these up about a month ago. No, I don't. I think I'm just letting it do its default. So there's a few other things I'm doing here. I want to use a pooled DB context, right? I want to take advantage of DB context pooling when I'm doing these tests because, that really makes things nice and fast. And we've had DB context pooling around for a long time, but remember with the EF Core 6, it now pools a lot more of those resources, not just DB context, but the connection and the command and some other things. So I definitely want to see the difference with that. So I'm using, this is part of Entity Framework Core, creating, adding a service. So there's something else interesting about this. You may be used to configuring services for dependency injection if you use ASP.NET Core. I'm using a console app here, right? You can't use Benchmarknet with ASP.NET Core. I could not figure out how to do this on my own. Shay showed me how to do it because he has a demo where he's doing it, but I could not get, you can't do dependency injection, in that way on top of Benchmark.net. There was just no other way to do it. So this is what I'm doing here. So taking advantage of creating service collection even in a console application, right? And then I'm using EF Core's add pooled DB context factory. So if DB context factory was introduced in EF Core 5 so that, we can't always inject a DB context into an application. They did that for the benefit of Blazor applications because they're client-side applications. So the DB context factory, it's not the DB context itself, but it's all the settings and the configuration that you need. So it's a factory. So the factory knows, you can see here that it should use SQL Server. And here's my connection string. And I want the query tracking behavior to set to no tracking, right? Because that's where I'm going to see the benefit. And so all the code is exactly the same in both versions, the EF Core 5 and the EF Core 6 version, except for this, because this is new, right? And I'm disabling the thread safety checks. Okay, so if you look at the code, that's the other big difference. So I'm taking advantage of all of those things. So now I've added my pooled DB context factory to the service, and then I'm building a service provider, and then I have an instance of the pooling factory that's going to be using my DB context. So if we look here, I just have this one tiny little class, right? And I have this very, very simple DB context. Really, it's nothing interesting going on in the DB context at all. So, where's my program? So, I'm creating the factory that will be for my context. Now, here are the methods. The first one has that pooling factory create a DB context for me. So it's creating it on the fly, but the pooling factory is feeding it all of the configuration information. And then I'm running a query that I predefined. So where is this query? Isn't it up here? Must be down below. Oh, no, here they are. So this is, again, this is not like how about creating real-world applications. This is so specific to the demo because, again, I'm actually, instead of defining the query in the method, I'm defining it and pre-compiling the query itself in advance because in my tests I don't want to take into account the cost of compiling a query. So I'm pre-compiling the query here. And there's two queries. The first one, which I call query 1, is just compiling this. Context, user reps, that's my DB set, take 1, right? So it'll just get the first one. And then my second query, which is called query 1K, is context user reps take 1,000. That's it. So in my methods that benchmark is going to run for me, I'm here, you can see, I'm just iterating. I'm saying go ahead and grab this query using the context that I just spun up and iterate through every single result. Okay? And I'm not doing anything with it. I'm just saying, just get the data and then just iterate through everything. So that's, not just executing the query, but it's literally going to read the whole stream and create, materialize the objects. And then the other one just runs the other query that only gets 1. Okay? Then I have a main method here, which uses the benchmarknet. It has a static class called benchmark runner, and it has a method called run, and I'm just saying run the program, and so the program does its job. All right, that's enough. We're not going to run it because it actually takes a little while because it does it does 100 warm-ups and 100 of this and 100 of that, and it does all this work. So I'm going to flip back to the slides. And these are the results of running that same application once, actually did it a bunch of times, just to make sure, it looked good, with EF Core 5 on .NET 6. And remember, in that case, yes, it's using DB context pooling, but it's not getting the benefit of all the improved pooling from EF Core 6. And it will be doing thread checking, right? So we're opting out in the other version. So for EF Core 5 on .NET 6, with doing 1,000 rows, my mean was about 3,000 microseconds per query. And with EF Core 6, it was about one and a half, right? So in that case, it looks like it's about 50% faster. So that was cool. But, again, this is not the lab environment. It's just my little computer doing its thing. But the other thing I wanted to point out is you're not going to see that kind of improvement when you're just querying one dumb little row, right? I mean, one row with the database I'm querying has like 10,000 or 10 million or 100,000. It has a lot. It's not 10,000. It's actually a lot more. It has a lot of rows in it. But there's just like two columns in each row. It's really not doing much at all. So you're not seeing that improvement over the two of those. So I'm actually going to stop there because this is pretty long, but it's thorough, and it's what I really, really wanted to be able to show you. What I'll do now, I'm going to do a whole bunch of these videos, right? So like this next one, I'll focus on the startup performance. But what I'm going to do is just scroll all the way to the end. Boop, boop. There's going to be so much more cool stuff to show. What is my husband doing up there? Okay. So I just want you to see, take a snapshot or whatever. These are the links for various things, more than what I'm showing you so far, but just things to be aware of, including, if you want more professional videos from me on Pluralsight. Here, the demos are all on GitHub. And so the official docs, a link to what's new in EF Core, breaking change in EF Core 6, breaking changes in EF Core 6. This is the that blog post that Shai wrote specifically about the performance. There's the EF Core repository, and also the EF Core team has about, I think they're bi-weekly stand-ups on YouTube live. They're live, so you can actually, ask questions, etc., but they're also recorded, right? So they're all on YouTube, and here's a link to those. So this will be on YouTube also. Yeah, I'm so happy I could just take whatever time I wanted to talk about the query performance. So this will be a series, and as a matter of fact, I'll give you a little highlight of what else is in the series. So let me just going over to PowerPoint on my other screen, so you can see this slide. It's actually hidden, so I will unhide it. So you can see what else I'm going to be showing you. Okay, so talk about query performance. The next video I'll do will be about startup performance. So there's definitely new improvements there. And we also have a really good new feature for making it easier to deploy migration. So that's going to be really, really cool. Temporal table support. That was actually really fun for me because I didn't even know what that was before. I was like, oh, here's a new feature. We support temporal tables. I'm like, what are temporal tables? We can do some bulk conventions now, much easier way. And also, if you're taking advantage of value conversions, we can do those in bulk also now. There's so much cool new stuff with a Cosmos DB provider. And what's extra cool about that is that a lot of the work they're doing will be able to be leveraged by other document databases like MongoDB, etc. If you care about group by queries, we had lots of support for group by queries in EF6. And so EF Core 6 actually has some great improvements for group by queries that bring us some more parity with EF6. So come back for the next videos in this series, which, I on the fly decided as I was talking, I think I'll just make this a series instead of like an 8-hour video because I like to talk about EF Core 6, not just talk about it. I love to show off the work that the team has done. I think it's brilliant. So this is, I'm going to go one more time, magically fly back to the end of my PowerPoints and just show you, here is my contact information and, my hair when I make it look a little nicer, I guess. Thanks.